They say blood is sacred, but to my parents, it is just red ink used to strike me from the inheritance. They are suing me for allegedly manipulating my grandmother out of $6.8 million. They believe she was just a senile woman in a wheelchair, unaware she spent 5 years turning her estate into a massive high-tech trap. Tomorrow's trial is not where I get judged. It is where their sentence begins. My name is Agnes Willoughby, and for the last 28 years, I have existed in the quiet margins of a life that was technically mine, but belonged entirely to her. I am a restorer of antique paintings at Vanguard Heritage, a private museum where silence is a currency and patience is the only religion. It is a job that requires me to look at things that are broken, faded, and forgotten, and then painstakingly bring them back to life using nothing but steady hands and a reverence for the past. I suppose that is why I was the only one who could tolerate living at the Ironwood for the past 7 years. To the rest of the world, my grandmother, Eleanor, was a formidable real estate tycoon who had lost her edge. To me, she was just like one of those cracked canvases I spent my days repairing, complex, layered, and in desperate need of someone who would not turn away when the varnish began to peel, but the varnish had finally stripped away completely. Eleanor was gone. At 86 years old, a massive stroke had taken her in the middle of the night, leaving the sprawling estate on the outskirts of Chicago feeling less like a home and more like a mausoleum. The funeral was held on a Tuesday that felt colder than any winter day I could remember. The wind whipped off Lake Michigan, cutting through the bare trees of the cemetery and biting at the exposed skin of the mourners. It was the kind of cold that settled in your bones and refused to leave, a physical manifestation of the emptiness that had opened up in my chest. I stood by the open grave, my hands clasped tightly in front of me, staring at the mahogany casket that seemed too small to contain a woman who had once commanded boardrooms and reshaped city skylines. Then I heard the gravel crunching. It was a distinctive sound, heavy and rhythmic, signaling the arrival of something substantial. I did not need to turn around to know who it was. The low hum of a Rolls-Royce engine purring to a stop nearby was enough. My parents had arrived. Robert and Cynthia Willoughby stepped out of the car with the practiced grace of actors taking the stage for a gala performance. They were dressed in impeccable black designer morning wear, the kind that cost more than my annual salary at the museum. My mother, Cynthia, wore a wide-brimmed hat with a veil that was sheer enough to show her perfectly applied waterproof mascara, but dark enough to suggest a mystery of grief that did not actually exist. My father, Robert, adjusted his silk tie and buttoned his cashmere coat, his face set in a grimace of stoic suffering that I had seen him practice in the mirror when I was a child. They walked toward the grave, flanked by a small entourage of assistants and, inevitably, a few discreet photographers they had likely tipped off themselves. They were the picture of filial devastation, to the onlookers, to the business partners and the distant relatives. They were the grieving son and daughter-in-law, finally returned from their important diplomatic and social obligations in Europe to say goodbye to the matriarch. But I knew better. I knew that the last time they had set foot in the Ironwood was over 5 years ago, and that visit had lasted less than 40 minutes. I knew that when I was 12 years old, they had sat me down in the drawing room and told me that my education would be better served under the tutelage of my grandmother. While they pursued political ambitions and social climbing in Paris and London, they had abandoned me not with tears, but with a sigh of relief, treating me like a piece of luggage that was too heavy to carry on their ascent to the upper echelons of society. Now, they were here. And the air around the gravesite seemed to thicken with their perfume, a cloying scent of roses and old money that masked the stench of their neglect. I watched as Cynthia approached the grave. She did not look at me. Her eyes were scanning the arrangement of the white lilies surrounding the casket. I saw her whisper something sharp to one of the funeral directors, gesturing vaguely at a wreath that was slightly off-center. She was directing the scene. She was making sure that the backdrop for her grief was aesthetically pleasing for the morning papers. Robert stood beside her, dabbing at dry eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief. He caught my eye for a brief second. There was no warmth there, no recognition of the shared loss. His gaze was calculating, sweeping over me as if he were appraising a piece of furniture he intended to auction off. He looked at my simple wool coat, my unstyled hair, and I saw a flicker of disdain before he returned his attention to the cameras. I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to scream, to tear down the flowers and shout at them to leave, but 7 years of living with Eleanor had taught me the power of silence. So I stood still. I let the tears run hot and silent down my face, not for the cameras, but for the woman who had actually raised me. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse toward the waiting cars for the reception, I felt a gentle touch on my elbow. I turned to see Mr. Sterling, my grandmother's personal attorney. He was a man of the old world, always dressed in three-piece suits, with a demeanor that suggested he carried the secrets of half the city in his briefcase. He had been with Eleanor for 40 years, and he was perhaps the only person here, aside from me, who actually cared that she was dead. "Agnes," he said softly, his voice gravelly with age. He moved closer, his body blocking the line of sight from where my parents were holding court with a group of investors near the cemetery gates. "Mr. Sterling," I replied, my voice cracking. "I am glad you are here." He did not smile. His expression was serious, his eyes darting quickly to ensure no one was watching us too closely. He reached into the pocket of his overcoat and withdrew his hand, keeping it cupped. He took my hand and pressed something cold and hard into my palm, then closed my fingers over it. "Keep this on your person," he whispered, the urgency in his tone cutting through the fog of my grief. "Do not show it to anyone, especially not them." I looked down at my fist, feeling the jagged edges of metal against my skin. It was a key, but it was not a normal house key. It felt heavy, made of iron or brass, with an intricate, twisted bow that felt ancient. "What is this?" I asked. Sterling shook his head slightly. "Not here. Just keep it safe. Eleanor wanted you to have it immediately, before I could ask anything else." He stepped back and nodded formally, melting away into the crowd of black coats. I slipped the key into the deep pocket of my coat, my heart hammering against my ribs. The weight of it felt significant, like an anchor in the storm that was brewing. I barely had time to process the interaction before a shadow fell over me. "Agnes." The voice was deep, smooth, and utterly devoid of genuine emotion. I turned to face my father. Robert Willoughby loomed over me, his face composed into a mask of paternal concern that did not reach his eyes. Up close, I could see the fine lines of stress around his mouth. The way his jaw worked slightly as if he were grinding his teeth. "Father," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He stepped in close, invading my personal space. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and the weight of it felt oppressive. A casual observer would have seen a father comforting his grieving daughter, but I felt the tension in his grip. He was not holding me. He was restraining himself. "A difficult day," he said, his eyes scanning the horizon over my shoulder. "Your mother is quite distraught. We all are." I said nothing. I knew Cynthia was currently laughing softly with a senator's wife near the flower arrangements. Robert cleared his throat, leaning in closer so that his voice was a low murmur near my ear. "Listen, Agnes, I know this is a chaotic time, and you are likely overwhelmed. But there are administrative matters that we need to handle swiftly to protect the estate." "Administrative matters," I repeated. We were still at the cemetery. The dirt had not even been shoveled onto the casket yet. "Yes," he said, a hint of impatience leaking into his tone. "Specifically regarding Eleanor's home office. I recall she kept a specific secure storage unit there. A blue safe, vintage model. Do you know the combination?" The question hung in the cold air between us. He did not ask how I was coping. He did not ask about my last moments with her. He did not ask if she had suffered. He asked about the blue safe. I stared at him, and for the first time in years, the fear I usually felt in his presence was replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. He was terrified. He was not grieving. He was panicking. There was a desperation in his eyes that the expensive suit could not hide. "I do not know," I lied smoothly. Grandma never let me into the office when she was working. She was very private about her finances. Robert's fingers tightened on my shoulder. Just for a second. Painful enough to be a warning. Are you sure? Agnes? Think carefully. It would save us a lot of legal trouble if we could access her papers immediately. I am sure, I said. Pulling away from his grip, I have to go. Father, I need to get back to the house. He watched me with a look that was pure ice. Very well. He said, we will see you at the reading of the will tomorrow. Do not be late. I turned and walked away, my legs trembling not from the cold, but from the adrenaline. I made my way to my small sedan, which looked like a toy car parked next to their limousine. As I drove away from the cemetery, looking in the rearview mirror, I saw Robert and Cynthia standing together, watching my car disappear. They looked like vultures on a branch, waiting for the moment they could descend and strip the bones clean. The drive back to the Ironwood was a blur. My mind was racing, replaying the conversation with my father and the strange exchange with Mr. Sterling. The key in my pocket felt hot against my leg. What had my grandmother been hiding? And why was my father so obsessed with a blue safe that I knew for a fact contained nothing but old property deeds and sentimental letters? When I pulled up to the gates of the estate, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, twisted shadows across the snow-covered lawn. The house loomed ahead, a Victorian Gothic monstrosity of dark stone and high turrets. To most, it was intimidating. To me, it had been a sanctuary. But tonight, it felt different. The windows were dark, staring back at me like hollow eyes. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the foyer. The silence was deafening. Usually, the house smelled of lavender and old paper. Tonight, it smelled different. It smelled of intrusion. I frowned, sensing a shift in the atmosphere. The rug in the hallway was slightly askew. A vase on the entry table was rotated a few inches to the left. These were small details, things that only someone who had spent 7 years dusting and caring for this place would notice. My heart began to pound. I walked quickly toward the library, the room where my grandmother had spent most of her final years. The door was ajar. I pushed it open and gasped. The room had not been destroyed, but it had been searched. It was a professional job. Drawers were closed. Books were on the shelves. But the order was wrong. Papers on the desk were stacked too neatly. The velvet chair was pushed in at an angle Eleanor never used. And in the corner, the painting covering the wall safe was slightly crooked. Someone had been here while we were at the funeral. I rushed to the wall safe. The blue safe Robert had asked about. It was locked. There were no scratch marks, no sign of forced entry. Whoever had been here did not have the combination, or they were looking for something else entirely. I backed out of the room, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I was alone in a 20-room mansion, clutching a mysterious key, with the realization that my parents were not just greedy. They were hunting, and whatever they were hunting for, they believed I stood in their way. I went to my room and locked the door, sliding the heavy brass bolt into place. I sat on the edge of my bed, pulling the strange antique key from my pocket. I held it up to the dim light of the lamp. It did not look like it belonged to a door. It looked like it belonged to a puzzle. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed the hour. 6 o'clock. The sun was gone. The darkness had truly arrived. And for the first time in my life, I was terrified of what the morning would bring. The office of Arthur Sterling was located on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, a place where the city looked like a circuit board of gray and steel beneath us. The conference room was vast, dominated by a table made of polished mahogany that was long enough to land a small aircraft on. The air smelled of lemon polish and expensive coffee. But beneath that sterile scent, there was the metallic tang of adrenaline. It was 10 o'clock in the morning, the day after the funeral. The room was crowded. It was not just family. It was a gathering of vultures. My parents sat at the head of the table, naturally. Robert and Cynthia Willoughby looked less like mourners today and more like generals waiting for a surrender treaty to be signed. They had shed the somber black of the gravesite for power suits, navy blue for him, sharp charcoal for her. They sat with their spines rigid, their hands resting on the table, projecting an image of absolute control. Surrounding them were the silent partners of the Willoughby dynasty, a few distant cousins I had not seen since I was a toddler, the chief financial officer of my father's company, and a handful of legal sharks from Viper and Cross, the firm my parents employed. They were all checking their watches, tapping their fingers, vibrating with an impatience that they barely bothered to conceal. I sat alone at the far end of the table. I felt small in the oversized leather chair. My hands were folded in my lap, my thumb tracing the outline of the strange, ancient key I had kept in my pocket since the cemetery. I had not slept. The image of my grandmother's ransacked office had played on a loop in my mind all night. I looked at my parents, searching for a sign of guilt. But all I saw was hunger. They were not looking at me. They were looking at the leather-bound folio in front of Mr. Sterling. Arthur Sterling sat at the center, a calm island in this sea of greed. He adjusted his spectacles, his movements deliberate and slow. He knew they were impatient, and I suspected he was taking his time on purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling began, his voice dry and steady, "we are gathered here to execute the last will and testament of Eleanor Rose Willoughby." A collective exhale went through the room. Robert leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. Sterling opened the folio. He began with the standard legalities, confirming Eleanor's state of mind at the time of writing, the dates, and the witnesses. Then, he moved to the valuation of the estate. As of the date of her passing, Sterling read, "The total value of Eleanor Willoughby's estate, after the deduction of outstanding taxes, charitable pledges, and settlement costs, is valued at $6,800,000. The number hung in the air. I saw Cynthia's eyes widen. A flicker of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. She exchanged a quick, triumphant glance with Robert. I could practically hear the gears turning in their heads. $6,800,000. It was a fortune to most, but to them, it was a lifeline. I knew about the rumors surrounding Willoughby Holdings, the failed investments in Eastern Europe, the quiet panic in their social circles. They needed this money. They needed it desperately. Sterling continued, listing the assets, the Ironwood estate, the portfolio of blue-chip stocks, the private collection of Renaissance art that I had helped her catalog. With every item listed, my parents grew taller in their chairs. They were already spending it. They were already liquidating the paintings, selling the land, erasing my grandmother's legacy to save their own crumbling facade. And now, for the distribution of assets. Sterling said. The room went deathly silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to pause. To my only son, Robert Willoughby, and his wife, Cynthia. Sterling read. Robert nodded, almost imperceptibly, extending his hand as if to receive a prize. I leave the following items. First, the antique porcelain tea set currently displayed in the east cabinet of the dining room. Specifically, the set featuring the hand-painted bluebirds. Robert blinked, his brow furrowed. The tea set? Sterling did not look up. He continued reading from the document. I leave this set to Robert specifically because I wish him to have the teapot that features the hairline crack down the center, the same crack that appeared when he was 10 years old, which he swore to me was caused by the clumsy hands of our housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. I knew then, Robert, that you had broken it and lied to save your own skin, costing a good woman her job. I kept it for 76 years as a reminder of your character. May it serve as a reminder to you now. The silence in the room changed texture. It went from anticipatory to suffocating. Robert's face drained of color, turning a sickly shade of gray. The embarrassment was physical. It was a slap in the face delivered from beyond the grave. And, Sterling continued, his voice devoid of irony, in addition to the tea set, I leave to Robert and Cynthia the sum of $1 each. For a second, nobody moved. The words seemed to take a moment to travel the length of the table and register in the brains of the recipients. $1? Cynthia whispered. Her voice was trembling. Sterling turned the page. The remainder of my estate. including the Ironwood property, the entire art collection, the stock portfolio, and all cash reserves, totaling $6,799,998. I leave to my granddaughter, Agnes Willoughby. The explosion was instantaneous. Cynthia stood up so fast her heavy leather chair slammed backward into the wall with a sound like a gunshot. She grabbed the crystal glass of water in front of her and hurled it across the room. It shattered against the mahogany paneling inches from Sterling's head, spraying water and shards of glass over the legal documents. "You lying old vulture!" Cynthia shrieked, her voice shredding the professional atmosphere of the office. "That is a fake. That is a forgery. Sit down, Mrs. Willoughby," Sterling said, not even flinching as water dripped from the frame of a diploma behind him. "No!" Cynthia screamed, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated, ugly rage. She pointed a manicured finger at me. "She did this. Look at her, sitting there like a little saint. She poisoned her mind. She made her sign it." Robert did not stand up. He sat very still. But the transformation in him was far more terrifying than Cynthia's theatrics. His hands were clenched into fists on the table, the knuckles white. He turned his head slowly to look at me. His eyes were not angry. They were dead. They were the eyes of a shark that had just realized its prey was fighting back. "You," Robert said. His voice was low, a dangerous rumble that cut through Cynthia's screaming. I shrank back into my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had expected disappointment. I had expected anger. I had not expected this level of raw, violent hatred. "You manipulated her," Robert said, speaking to me as if I were a stain on his shoe. "You spent 7 years whispering poison in her ear, a senile old woman. You took advantage of a woman with dementia. She did not have dementia," I said. My voice was small, shaky, but it was there. She was sharp as a tack until the very end. "Liar!" Cynthia yelled, slamming her hands onto the table. She was confused. She forgot names. "You locked us out so you could twist her mind. You are a thief. Agnes, a dirty, ungrateful little thief. Agnes is the rightful beneficiary." Sterling interjected, his voice raising for the first time. "And I suggest you control your temper, Mrs. Willoughby." Robert stood up then. He rose slowly, unfolding his height until he loomed over the table. He ignored Sterling completely. He walked down the length of the table toward me. The other lawyers and business partners pulled their chairs back, clearing a path. Unwilling to get in between a father and the daughter he looked ready to strangle. He stopped right beside my chair. I could smell his cologne, expensive and overpowering. I looked up at him, trembling. "You think you have won, Agnes?" he asked softly. "You think because an old man read a piece of paper that you are going to walk away with my money?" "It is not your money," I whispered. "It is hers. And she gave it to me." Robert laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "You have no idea how the world works. You stupid girl. You have spent your life hiding in museums and dusting old houses. You do not know what I am capable of." He leaned down, his face inches from mine. I could see the veins pulsing in his temple. "I will bury you," he hissed. "I will drag your name through the mud so deep you will never be able to show your face in this city again. I will prove she was insane. I will prove you coerced her. And when I am done, you will not just be poor. Agnes, you will be in prison." "Mr. Willoughby," Sterling shouted, standing up, "that is enough. I will have security remove you." Robert straightened up, adjusting his cuffs. He looked at Sterling with a sneer of absolute contempt. "Save your breath. Arthur," Robert said, "we are leaving. But this is not over." He turned back to me, his eyes cold and hard as flint. "Enjoy the victory lap. Agnes, it will be short." Cynthia was already at the door, gathering her bag, her chest heaving. She looked at me with a mixture of loathing and disbelief. I gave birth to a monster. She spat. They stormed out of the room, their entourage scrambling to follow them like frightened dogs. The heavy door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. I sat frozen, unable to move. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving me feeling weak and nauseous. I looked at Sterling. He was dabbing the water off his papers with a handkerchief. He looked tired. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Can they do that? Can they prove she was incompetent?" Sterling sighed, taking off his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "They can try, Agnes, and they will try. They will claim she lacked testamentary capacity. They will claim you exercised undue influence. But we have the medical records." I said, "You said she was tested." "We do," Sterling said. "We have a clean bill of mental health from doctor. Ours dated 2 weeks before the will was updated." "It is strong evidence." I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. I remembered the look in my father's eyes. "But?" I asked. Sterling looked at me, and his expression was grim. "But your father is a man with significant resources and very few scruples." He said, "He has hired Viper and Cross. They are not just lawyers, they are destroyers. They do not need the truth to win. They just need to create enough doubt, enough scandal, to force a settlement or sway a judge." I remembered what Robert had said right before he left. The threat had been specific. He said truth is something you buy. I recalled. Sterling nodded slowly. "In his world, it often is," he said. He walked over to me and placed a hand on my shoulder. It was a fatherly gesture, one I had never received from the man who had just threatened to put me in prison. "Agnes, you need to be very careful," Sterling said. "This was not a temper tantrum. That was a declaration of war. They are desperate, and desperate people are dangerous. You need to go back to the ironwood and lock the doors. Do not speak to anyone. Do not answer the phone unless it is me." I nodded, standing up on shaky legs. I clutched my purse against my chest. I felt the weight of the key in my pocket again. "Why did she do it this way?" I asked. "Why did she leave them the tea set? Why provoke them?" Sterling looked at the shattered glass on the floor, then back at me. A small, sad smile touched his lips, because Eleanor knew them better than anyone. He said, "She knew that if she just cut them out, they would claim it was a mistake, by leaving them the tea set, by referencing that specific lie. She proved she was lucid. She proved she remembered everything. She wanted to make sure that when they stood in court to call her senile, that tea set would be sitting there as evidence that she saw right through them." He paused. "She was protecting you, Agnes, in her own way, but now, you have to protect yourself." I left the office 10 minutes later. The elevator ride down 42 floors felt like a descent into the underworld. When I stepped out into the lobby, I half expected the police to be waiting for me, but it was just the usual bustle of the city. However, as I walked to my car, I saw a black van parked across the street. The window was rolled down just an inch, and I saw the glint of a camera lens. My stomach dropped. They had not just threatened media warfare, they had already started it. I got into my car and locked the doors immediately. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. As I pulled out into traffic, Robert's voice echoed in my head. "In this country, the truth is something you can buy." I drove toward the Ironwood, the $6,800,000 fortress that was now mine. But it did not feel like a fortune. It felt like a target. And as I merged onto the highway, I realized with a chilling certainty that my parents would burn it all to the ground before they let me keep a single brick. 2 weeks after the funeral, the sky over Chicago turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy and suffocating. It was a fitting backdrop for the arrival of the process server. He did not look like a harbinger of doom. He looked like a college student in a windbreaker, chewing gum with an indifference that felt insulting given the weight of the envelope he shoved into my hands. "You have been served," he mumbled, not even making eye contact before turning back to his idling sedan. I stood on the front porch of the Ironwood. The heavy oak door opened behind me, and stared at the thick packet of documents. The return address was embossed in silver leaf. Viper and Cross, Even the name sounded like a threat. I tore it open right there in the cold, my fingers numb. The legal jargon was dense, but the accusations jumped out at me like physical blows. Elder abuse, undue influence, fraudulent conversion of assets, intentional infliction of emotional distress. My parents were not just contesting the will, they were rewriting history. In their version of reality, I was not the devoted granddaughter who had nursed Eleanor through her final years. I was a predator, a manipulator who had isolated a vulnerable, senile woman to steal her fortune. They were suing me for everything: the estate, the stocks, the art, and punitive damages that would leave me in debt for 3 lifetimes. I went inside and locked the door. Leaning my back against the wood as I slid down to the floor, I felt nauseous. The house, usually so warm and full of memories, suddenly felt vast and empty. The attack was coordinated, swift, and brutal. It started with the money. The next morning, I drove to the local grocery store. I needed milk, eggs, and coffee, basic things to keep myself alive while I figured out how to fight back. When I swiped my debit card, the machine let out a harsh, rejective beep. I frowned, rubbing the chip on my sleeve. "Try it again, please," I told the cashier, a teenage girl named Sarah who I had known for years. She tried it. Beep, declined. "Agnes, it says—" Sarah lowered her voice, looking around nervously. "It says card seized." My stomach dropped. I pulled out my credit card. Declined. I pulled out my emergency card. Declined. I stepped out of the line, leaving my groceries on the belt, my face burning with humiliation as the people behind me whispered. I called the bank from the parking lot. The representative was polite but unyielding. "I am sorry. Ms. Willoughby," she said. "We received an emergency freezing order from the court this morning regarding the estate dispute. All accounts under your name, or associated with the deceased, are locked pending a preliminary hearing." "But that is my personal account," I shouted, my voice cracking. "My salary is in there." "It is standard procedure in fraud cases of this magnitude," she replied. I hung up. I had $40 in cash in my wallet. That was it. My parents had not just sued me, they had cut off my air supply. The second blow came 3 days later. I received a summons to the office of Mr. Henderson, the director of Vanguard Heritage. I loved my job. Restoring paintings was the one thing that was purely mine, separate from the Willoughby name. I thought, naively, that the museum would be my sanctuary. Mr. Henderson did not offer me coffee. He sat behind his desk, rearranging a stack of papers, refusing to meet my eyes. "Agnes," he began, his voice tight, "you know we value your work here. You are one of the best restorers we have ever had." "But?" I asked, feeling the cold dread settling in my chest. "But," he sighed, finally looking at me, "we have received several calls, important calls, from major donors and board members. My mother," I said flatly. He flinched. "Cynthia Willoughby is a very influential woman in the arts community. Agnes, she has expressed deep concern about your character. She has suggested that having someone currently under investigation for elder abuse on our staff might complicate our upcoming fundraising gala." "I am not under investigation," I protested, standing up. "It is a civil suit. It is a lie. Perception is reality." "Agnes," he said, cutting me off, "until this legal matter is resolved, we think it is best if you take a leave of absence." "Paid?" I asked, knowing the answer, "unpaid." He said softly, "To avoid any conflict of interest with the museum's finances." I walked out of the museum carrying a box of my personal tools, my brushes, my magnifiers, my solvents. I stood on the sidewalk, unemployed, broke, and branded. Then came the media. Viper and Cross did not just fight in the courtroom, they fought in the court of public opinion. My mother must have given an exclusive interview, because the Sunday tabloids were vicious. I saw the headline at a newsstand while walking to my car. "The Angel of Death? Granddaughter accused of isolating real estate tycoon in final years." The article was a masterpiece of fiction, It quoted anonymous family friends who claimed I had banned Robert and Cynthia from visiting. It claimed I had screened Eleanor's calls, intercepting her mail, feeding her lies about her son's business. It painted a picture of a lonely, confused old woman trapped in a Gothic mansion with a greedy, calculating 20-something. They twisted everything. The times I had told my parents Eleanor was too tired to see them, because she was recovering from chemotherapy they did not even know about, were spun as me barring the door. The fact that I managed her finances was spun as me embezzling funds. The effect was immediate. I lived in a small, tight-knit community outside Chicago where everyone knew the Willoughby name. Suddenly, the smiles stopped. When I walked down the street, people crossed to the other side. Neighbors I had known for 7 years, people who had brought casseroles when Eleanor died, now closed their blinds when they saw me coming. I was radioactive. The isolation was not just social, it was physical. I retreated into the ironwood, locking the gates. I spent my days pacing the long hallways, the silence of the house amplified by the noise in my head. And then, the nights turned terrifying. It started with the phone, the old landline in the hallway, which I kept because cell service was spotty in the stone house, began to ring at odd hours. 2 in the morning, 4 in the morning. I made the mistake of answering the first time. "Give it back, you bitch," a distorted voice rasped. "You do not deserve a penny." I hung up, my hands shaking. I unplugged the phone. But the silence that followed was even worse. It felt like the house was holding its breath. By the end of the second week, I was fraying at the edges. My food supplies were running low. I was eating canned soup and stale crackers. I had not spoken to a human soul who wasn't a lawyer or a cashier in 14 days. That was when the house began to turn against me. It was a Tuesday night. I was in the kitchen, trying to heat up a can of tomato soup. Outside, the wind was howling, rattling the window panes. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Once, twice, then, with a definitive pop, the kitchen went black. I froze. A power outage? In this neighborhood? The ironwood was on the same grid as the hospital. We rarely lost power. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight. I walked to the sink to get a glass of water, my mouth dry with fear. I turned the tap. Nothing. Not a drop. Then, a groaning sound from the pipes, and a sputter of brown sludge. Electricity and water, both gone at the exact same moment. This was not a storm. This was sabotage. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was my father. He knew the infrastructure of this estate better than anyone. He knew where the main breakers were. He knew how to shut off the well pump. He was trying to flush me out. He wanted to make living here so unbearable, so terrifying, that I would run screaming to his lawyers and sign whatever settlement they put in front of me. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at my throat. I was alone in the dark, in a house that felt like it was closing in on me. The temperature was already dropping. Think, Agnes, think. I needed light. My phone battery was at 12%. I could not waste it. Candles. I remembered there were emergency candles in the main hall, in the drawer of the antique console table. I navigated the house by the weak beam of my phone. The shadows stretched long and distorted across the walls. Every creak of the floorboard sounded like a footstep. Was someone outside? Were they watching the house go dark? Laughing in their warm car? I reached the main hall. It was a cavernous space, dominated by a grand staircase and a high, vaulted ceiling. The moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting eerie pools of blue and red on the marble floor. I found the console table and yanked the drawer open. Empty. No. I frantically felt around the back of the drawer. Nothing. The candles were gone. Had I used them? Or had someone taken them during the funeral reception? I let out a sob of frustration. Leaning back against the cold stone wall, I felt defeated. They had taken my money, my reputation, my job, and now they had taken my light. As I slid down the wall, clutching my phone, the beam of light swung wildly across the room. It swept over the portraits of my ancestors, over the heavy velvet drapes, and landed on the sculpture in the center of the foyer. It was a piece my grandmother had bought 5 years ago, shortly after she had retreated from public life. It was a strange, modern bronze casting, out of place among the classical decor. It depicted a figure, vaguely human but abstract, hunched over in deep contemplation, its arms wrapped around itself. It was titled, "The Keeper of Secrets." I had always hated it. It looked pained. It looked lonely. But as the light hit the base of the statue, something glinted. I stopped crying. I wiped my eyes and shone the light directly on the sculpture. There, on the side of the bronze pedestal, almost invisible against the dark patina of the metal, was a small, oddly shaped indentation. It was not a flaw in the casting. It was too regular, too deliberate. It looked like a keyhole. My heart skipped a beat. My hand flew to my pocket. I had worn the same pair of jeans for 3 days, and the heavy weight of the key Mr. Sterling had given me was still there, pressing against my thigh. "Keep it on your person," he had said. "Do not show it to anyone." I scrambled to my feet, my fatigue forgotten. I approached the statue slowly, as if it were a living thing. Up close, the indentation was intricate, shaped like a starburst with jagged edges. I pulled the key out. The metal was warm from my body heat. I compared the bow of the key to the hole in the statue. It looked like a match. Why would a statue have a keyhole? Was it a safe? A jewelry box? I took a deep breath, glancing at the front door as if expecting my father to burst in with a battering ram. The house was silent. The only sound was the wind and the frantic thumping of my own heart. I inserted the key. It slid in with a satisfying, oily smoothness. It fit perfectly. I turned it. There was a loud click, followed by the sound of gears grinding, a heavy mechanical sound that echoed in the empty hall. The torso of the statue did not open. Instead, the entire upper half of the bronze figure rotated 45 degrees to the left. I gasped and stepped back. Revealed in the hollow space where the statue's chest had been was not a cavity for jewelry, but a small, sleek panel with a single USB port and a small LED light that blinked green. It was modern technology hidden inside a shell of art. I stared at it, my mind racing. A USB port? In a statue? This was what Mr. Sterling had meant. This was what my father was looking for. This was why he wanted the blue safe. He thought the secrets were on paper. He thought Eleanor was old-fashioned. But Eleanor was not old-fashioned. She was a visionary. I realized then that I was holding my breath. I had my laptop in my backpack upstairs. It had 20% charge left. I did not wait. I ran up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, the fear of the dark replaced by a burning, desperate curiosity. I grabbed my laptop and ran back down. I sat on the cold marble floor, the light from the screen illuminating my face in the darkness. I plugged the laptop into the statue's port using a connecting cable I always carried. The screen flickered. A dialog box popped up. Accessing Project Nemesis. Password required. I froze. A password. Of course there was a password. I stared at the blinking cursor. What would she use? Her birthday? My birthday? The name of her first dog? I tried Ironwood. Access denied. I tried Vanguard. Access denied. I tried Eleanor. Access denied. I closed my eyes, trying to channel her. I thought about the last conversation we had, the day before the stroke. She had been sitting in the garden, looking at the roses. She had held my hand and said, "Agnes, never forget that the truth is the only thing they cannot bill you for." I opened my eyes. I typed in one word, truth. The screen flashed red. Incorrect password. I cursed under my breath. Think deeper. What did she hate most? What was this whole setup about? It was about them. It was about Robert and Cynthia. I remembered the will, the specific items she left them, the tea set, the cracked tea set. I typed in the date Robert broke the tea set. She had mentioned it in the will. August 12th, 1950. 08121950. Enter. The screen turned green. Access granted. My breath hitched. A folder opened on my desktop. It was simply labeled, "Watch Me." I clicked it. It wasn't a document. It was a portal, a link to a secure, private cloud server. The interface loaded, and suddenly, my screen was filled with a grid of video thumbnails. Hundreds of them. Each one was dated and time-stamped. I clicked on the most recent one. The video feed was grainy at first, then sharpened into high definition. I recognized the angle immediately. It was a view from the ceiling of the main living room, the room I was currently sitting in, but the camera was hidden. Pinhole cameras. I watched the screen. It showed my parents, Robert and Cynthia, sitting on the sofa. The date stamp was 3 weeks ago. My grandmother was in the frame, sitting in her wheelchair, her head bowed, looking asleep. Robert leaned forward, checking to make sure she was out. Then he turned to Cynthia. "We need to up the dosage." "Cynthia," he said. His voice was crystal clear. The microphone quality was professional grade. "We cannot kill her." "Robert," Cynthia replied, pouring herself a drink from my grandmother's crystal decanter. "Not yet. We need her to sign the power of attorney first. If she dies before that, we have to deal with the girl. She is taking too long to lose it." Robert hissed. "The doctor said the pills would make her pliable. She is still fighting. Then mix it with her tea," Cynthia said, taking a sip of her drink. "Just make sure Agnes does not see." I clapped a hand over my mouth to stifle a scream. The horror washed over me, cold and absolute. They were not just waiting for her to die. They were poisoning her. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in my eyes, surrounded by a silence that was no longer empty. It was filled with the voices of ghosts. My grandmother had known. She had known everything, and she had recorded it all. This was not just a defense against a lawsuit. This was a murder investigation. I looked at the statue, the silent guardian of the truth. My fear evaporated, replaced by a rage so hot it almost burned. I was not the victim anymore. I was the witness, and for the first time in 2 weeks, I smiled. It was a grim, dangerous smile. "Let them cut the power," I whispered to the empty room. "I have all the light I need." The heavy bronze figure sat hunched in eternal contemplation in the center of the foyer, its silhouette stark against the moonlight bleeding through the high windows. It was a variation of the Thinker, a piece I had walked past 1,000 times without a second glance, assuming it was just another expensive dust collector my grandmother had acquired during her eccentric phase. Now, however, it looked less like art and more like a vault. My hands were trembling, not from the cold that was rapidly seeping into the house, but from the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I held the antique key Mr. Sterling had given me, its edges biting into my thumb. I knelt on the marble floor, the flashlight from my phone clamped between my teeth, and guided the key into the small, starburst-shaped indentation on the statue's base. It fit with a terrifying precision. I turned it to the right. There was no rusty squeak, no resistance. Instead, there was a smooth, hydraulic hiss, followed by the faint hum of gears engaging. The heavy bronze plinth did not open like a door. It slid forward. A panel, seamlessly cut into the metal, retracted to reveal a recessed compartment lined with velvet. Inside, pulsing with a faint blue light, was a single female USB port. It was a jarring anachronism, high-end technology embedded in 19th century aesthetics. It was exactly the kind of contradiction Eleanor loved. I scrambled backward, grabbing my backpack. I pulled out my old laptop, a battered machine I had used in college. It was the only piece of electronics the lawyers had not seized because it was technically registered to the university I had attended years ago. Not to me or the estate. I prayed the battery held. It had been sitting in my closet for months. I pressed the power button. The screen flickered to life, casting a ghostly pale glow over the darkened hallway. 12% battery. It would have to be enough. I connected the cable from the statue to the laptop. The computer chimed, a cheerful sound that felt obscenely loud in the silent house. A window popped up on the screen instantly, bypassing my operating system entirely. It was a secure bootloader. The screen went black, and then a single line of text appeared in green code. Welcome to Project Nemesis. I stared at the name, Nemesis, the goddess of retribution. My grandmother had not just been protecting her assets, she had been planning a war. The interface that loaded was sophisticated, far beyond anything I expected from a woman who supposedly struggled to program her thermostat. It was a cloud-based dashboard, organized with the meticulous precision of a forensic accountant. There were folders labeled with dates, names, and locations, but the largest folder, pulsing with a red tag, was simply titled Surveillance Archive. I clicked it. A map of the Ironwood estate appeared on the screen. It was a blueprint, but it was covered in small glowing dots. I zoomed in. The dots were labeled chandelier, drawing room, smoke detector, master bedroom, bookshelf, library, portrait eyes, dining hall. My breath caught in my throat. She had bugged the entire house. I realized then that the privacy I thought we had shared was an illusion. But it was a protective one. Eleanor had turned her home into a panopticon. She had been watching, and judging by the file dates, she had been watching for 5 years. I navigated to the video files. There were terabytes of data here. I filtered them by the tag. Priority. The first video that appeared was dated 3 years ago. The thumbnail showed my parents, Robert and Cynthia, sitting in the drawing room. I put on my headphones, creating a seal against the silence of the house, and pressed play. The video quality was crystal clear, likely 4K resolution captured through a hidden lens. My parents were sitting on the beige sofa, glasses of wine in their hands. They looked younger, less stressed, but the cruelty in their eyes was the same. We cannot wait for nature to take its course. Robert, Cynthia said. Her voice was sharp, devoid of the syrupy sweetness she used in public. The company needs the capital injection by the end of the fiscal year. If we do not get control of her accounts, the audit will expose everything. Robert swirled his wine, looking at the fireplace. She is stubborn, Cynthia, and she is healthy. Her heart is strong. Then we make her unhealthy. Cynthia replied calmly, or at least, we make her appear that way. I watched, horrified. As my father nodded, I have been talking to Dr. Thorne. He is willing to sign the competency papers if we can provide a documented history of cognitive decline. But we need incidents. We need her to look confused in front of the staff. We need her to fall. We need her to forget things. I can arrange that, Cynthia said. Taking a sip of wine, a few adjustments to her routine, a few changes to her diet. We can make her world slippery. I paused the video, feeling bile rise in my throat. They were discussing the psychological dismantling of my grandmother with the casual tone of a couple deciding where to go for dinner. They had planned to gaslight her into an asylum. I clicked on the next video. This one was dated just 8 months ago. The location was the kitchen. The camera angle was high, hidden perhaps in the ventilation hood above the island. It showed the kitchen counter, cluttered with my grandmother's daily medications. There was her pill organizer, the plastic box marked with the days of the week. Cynthia walked into the frame. She was alone. She looked over her shoulder, checking the hallway, checking for me. I remembered this day. I had gone to the pharmacy to pick up a refill. I had left Cynthia alone with Grandma for less than an hour. In the video, Cynthia opened her purse. She took out a small orange bottle. Then, with steady, practiced hands, she popped open the compartments of the pill organizer for Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. She tipped the contents of the Tuesday compartment into her hand. She picked out the small, white, round pills, her blood pressure medication. She dropped them into her pocket. Then, she took pills from her own bottle, identical white, round pills, and dropped them into the organizer. I leaned closer to the screen, squinting. I needed to know what she was swapping. Cynthia did it quickly. She replaced the life-saving heart medication with something else. Then she closed the organizer, put the bottle back in her purse, and washed her hands in the sink as if she had just finished baking cookies. I frantically minimized the video player and opened a text document in the same folder titled Analysis, Private Investigator Report. My grandmother had hired a PI. The document detailed the contents of the trash bags retrieved from my parents' home. Subject: Cynthia Willoughby, discarded prescription bottles found, diuretics, sedatives, strong antihistamines. I froze. The white pills Cynthia had put in the box were not poison in the traditional sense. They were likely a cocktail of sedatives, or perhaps powerful diuretics meant to cause dehydration and confusion. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I remembered the days when Eleanor would suddenly become lethargic, unable to lift her head. I remembered the times she would slur her speech, and I would panic, thinking she was having a mini-stroke. I remembered the doctors at the hospital shaking their heads, saying it was just progression of age or vascular dementia. It was not dementia. It was a chemical assault. They were drugging her. They were systematically poisoning her to mimic the symptoms of senility so they could seize power of attorney. And when that failed, when she refused to sign, they had kept doing it, weakening her heart until it finally gave out. This was not just fraud. This was not just a family dispute. I looked at the screen, at the frozen image of my mother's manicured hand dropping a pill into the box. This was murder. I felt tears streaming down my face, hot and angry. I wiped them away fiercely. My grandmother had known. She had watched this footage. I could only imagine the heartbreak she must have felt, sitting in her wheelchair, reviewing the evidence of her own son and daughter-in-law plotting her demise. But she had not called the police. Not then. Why? I clicked on a folder named The Trap. Inside was a voice memo recorded by Eleanor herself. I clicked play. Her voice filled the dark hallway, raspy but strong, echoing from beyond the grave. Agnes, if you are listening to this, then I am gone, and they have made their move. I could have sent them to jail years ago. But they would have used their lawyers to wriggle out of it. They would have claimed I was crazy. They would have settled out of court. I needed them to commit the final sin. I needed them to sue you. By suing you, they have opened the door to discovery. They have brought the law into this house. And now, you have the weapon to finish them. She had used herself as bait. She had endured the poisoning, the confusion, the betrayal, just to gather enough evidence to ensure that when they finally struck, they would not just lose the money, they would lose their freedom. I looked at the file list again. There were hundreds of videos, conversations about bribing judges, conversations about laundering money through the foundation, conversations about me, calling me the little parasite and discussing how to ensure I ended up destitute. The battery warning flashed on my screen. 5% remaining. I did not panic. I had seen enough. I quickly located the download all function. The statue had a high-speed direct connection. I plugged in a backup external hard drive I had in my backpack, a terabyte drive I used for my art restoration files. I initiated the transfer. The progress bar crawled across the screen, transferring 20%, 30% outside. The wind howled, battering the heavy oak doors. I heard a noise, a distinct, metallic scratch against the lock of the front door. Someone was trying to get in. I glanced at the door, then back at the screen. My parents were not content to wait for the cold to flush me out. They had sent someone, maybe not them, but someone on their payroll, a scare tactic, or worse, 60%. I sat motionless, the light of the laptop the only thing visible in the cavernous hall. I was vulnerable, I was alone, but I was armed with 5 years of recorded sins. 90%. The doorknob turned. The heavy deadbolt held. But the wood groaned under pressure. They were using a crowbar. Transfer complete. I yanked the drive out. I shut the laptop. I turned the key in the statue, and the bronze panel slid shut with a silent, heavy finality. The USB port vanished. The blue light died. The thinker returned to his pose, guarding the secrets once more. I stood up in the darkness, clutching the hard drive to my chest. Let them break in. Let them come. They were looking for a scared girl in a dark house. They were about to find the executioner. The scratching at the door had stopped an hour ago. Whoever my parents had sent to terrorize me, a private investigator, a hired thug, Or perhaps just a local vandal paid to rattle the windows. Had given up against the storm and the solid oak of the main entrance, but I did not move from the foyer. I sat with my back against the cold stone of the statue, the external hard drive humming warmly against my chest. Connected to my laptop, the house was silent again, but the silence was no longer empty. It was filled with data. I had spent the last 2 hours organizing the files. The video evidence of the poisoning was damning, shocking enough to send anyone to prison for attempted murder. But as I scrolled through the folders, I realized that the medical tampering was just the how. I still did not understand the why. My parents were greedy. Yes, they were shallow, certainly, but murder? Murder required a desperation that went beyond a desire for a new yacht or a summer home in the Hamptons. I found the answer in a folder labeled Audio Surveillance, Landline. My grandmother, in her infinite paranoia and brilliance, had tapped her own landline phone. It made sense. Cell phones were personal, but the house phone in the library was communal. It was the phone Robert used when he visited because the reception in the library for mobile devices was notoriously poor due to the thick stone walls. He thought he was escaping the digital grid. He did not know he was speaking directly into a recorder. I put my headphones back on. There were dozens of files. I skipped the ones labeled with innocent dates and focused on a cluster of recordings from 6 months ago. Around the same time, Cynthia had started swapping the heart medication. I clicked on a file dated November 14th. Robert's voice filled my ears. It was tight, breathless, lacking the polished baritone he used in boardrooms. "I am telling you, we are exposed," Robert said. He was whispering, but the gain on the microphone had been cranked up. "The audit is scheduled for next quarter. If the state regulators see the books for the pension fund, we are done." A second voice on the line answered. It was distorted, likely a burner phone, but the tone was aggressive. "You said you could cover the shortfall. Bob, you said the liquidity was there." "It was there," Robert hissed back. "But the Brazilian deal collapsed. The infrastructure project in Sao Paulo is gone. The money is gone." "How much?" the other voice asked. $6 million, Robert said. "Maybe 6.2 million with the interest penalties. I need to plug the hole before the auditors arrive in March. If they see the gap, they will file criminal charges. This isn't just a fine. This is securities fraud. This is embezzlement of public funds." My blood ran cold. I paused the track and stared at the waveform on the screen. $6 million. The number echoed in my head. The value of Eleanor's estate, after taxes and charity, was roughly $6.8 million. It was almost a perfect match. This was not about inheritance. This was not about them feeling slighted by a tea set. This was a rescue mission. My father had embezzled money from a public investment fund, likely a teacher's pension or a municipal bond, and lost it on bad foreign investments. He was facing federal prison. The only thing that could save him from a 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary was my grandmother's money. I played the next file. "She is still holding on," Robert said, his voice trembling with rage. "The old bat won't die, and she won't sign the power of attorney. I tried to bring the notary yesterday, but she pretended to be asleep." "You do not have time for nature to take its course," the other voice warned. "You have 3 months. Fix it. We are escalating," Robert replied. "Cynthia is handling the medication. It will look like heart failure, but we need access to the accounts the second she is gone. If that girl gets the money, if the girl gets the money, you go to jail, Bob. It is that simple." I took off the headphones, my hands shaking so hard I had to grip the edge of the laptop to steady them. It all made sense. The desperation, the immediate lawsuit, the freezing of my accounts. They were not just trying to bankrupt me. They were trying to force a settlement before the audit in March. They needed the cash now. Every day I fought them was a day closer to their prison sentences. They were cornered animals, and that made them infinitely more dangerous than I had realized. I opened a new document and started typing. I was not writing a story. I was building a case. I created a timeline. Column A, the poisoning. I listed every date I had video evidence of Cynthia tampering with the medication. Column B, the financials. I listed the dates of Robert's frantic phone calls. The correlation was perfect. Every time the deadline for the audit was mentioned, the dosage of the tampering increased. They were adjusting the speed of my grandmother's death to match their financial calendar. It was cold, calculated, and terrifyingly logical. I minimized the timeline and opened a subfolder I had missed earlier. It was hidden inside the system directory, labeled simply for Agnes. My heart hammered against my ribs. I double-clicked it. It was a digital journal, hundreds of entries, written by my grandmother over the last 5 years. I scrolled to the very end, to an entry dated just 2 days before her stroke. My dearest Agnes, the entry began. I know you are angry. I know you are wondering why I did not tell you, why I let you live in this house while I played this dangerous game. You must understand, my child, you are too gentle. You have your grandfather's heart. If I had told you that your father was a thief and your mother was poisoning me, you would have tried to save them. You would have begged them to stop. You would have called the police too early, and they would have lawyered their way out of it. They would have claimed I was paranoid. They would have won. I felt a tear slide down my cheek, hot and stinging. She knew me better than I knew myself. I had to leave you a weapon, not just money. She wrote, money can be stolen, money can be frozen by a judge, but the truth? The truth is a blade that never dulls. I have given you the evidence, but evidence is useless if you do not know how to wield it. Do not just show this to the world. Use it. Make them afraid. They think you are a sheep. Show them you are the wolf. I wiped my face. The sadness that had weighed on me since the funeral began to evaporate. In its place, something harder, colder, and sharper began to form. A cold resolve settled in my stomach. She was right. If I released the videos now, they would claim they were deepfakes. They would drag the case out for years while Robert's lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence. I needed to make them panic. I needed them to make a mistake. I reached for my phone. I needed an ally. There was only one person I could trust. I dialed Arthur Sterling's private number. It was 3 a.m, but he answered on the second ring. Agnes? His voice was rough with sleep but alert. Are you safe? I am inside the house, I said, keeping my voice low. Mr. Sterling, I found it. I found everything. What did you find? He asked. I found Project Nemesis. I said, I have videos. I have audio. I know about the $6 million. I know about the embezzlement. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Then, a heavy sigh. Eleanor, he whispered, you magnificent woman, Mr. Sterling, I continued, my voice gaining strength. They are trying to starve me out. They cut the power. They cut the water. I know, Sterling said. They are pressuring me too. Agnes, I received a notice from the Bar Association yesterday. An anonymous complaint was filed against me, claiming I forged the will. Viper and Cross are threatening to have me disbarred if I do not advise you to settle. They offered me a way out. If I convince you to sign over the estate, the complaint disappears. They are trying to isolate us. I said, yes, Sterling agreed, and it is working. Agnes, if we go to court with what you have, it will be a bloodbath, but it will take time. Do you have the stamina for this? I looked at the statue of the thinker, at the closed panel that hid the heart of my grandmother's vengeance. I am not going to court yet, I said, not until I am ready. What are you planning? Sterling asked, a note of caution in his voice. I am going to send them a message. I said, Grandma said I needed to stop being a sheep. Agnes, be careful. Sterling warned, do not commit extortion. I am not asking for money. Mr. Sterling, I am just sharing a family memory. I hung up before he could talk me out of it. I opened a web browser on my laptop. I connected to a VPN, routing my signal through servers in Switzerland and then Panama, masking my IP address completely. I created a new, encrypted email account. No name, no identifiers. I went back to the video folder. I found the clip of Cynthia in the kitchen. The moment she held the heart medication in one hand and the placebo in the other. I scrubbed the timeline until I found the perfect frame. It was a close-up of her hand, the pill hovering over the Tuesday slot of the organizer. Her face was visible in the background, focused and malicious. I took a screenshot. I opened an image editing software and applied a heavy blur filter to the edges, leaving only the hand and the pill organizer in sharp focus. It was ghostly. It looked like a memory surfacing from a nightmare. It was undeniable to anyone who was there, but vague enough to be confusing to anyone else. I composed a new email to Robert. Willoughby Holdings, com. Subject, the Tuesday problem. I attached the image. I typed a single sentence in the body of the email. I know what happened to the heart pills, and soon, the auditors will know what happened to the $6 million. I stared at the screen. My finger hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. Once I sent this, I was no longer the victim defending herself. I was the hunter setting a snare. I thought about the cold nights in this house. I thought about the way Robert had looked at me at the funeral, like I was trash to be discarded. I thought about Cynthia poisoning the woman who had given her a home. I pressed send. The message vanished into the ether. I sat back, watching the screen. Somewhere in the city, in a penthouse apartment overlooking the lake, a notification was about to ping on Robert's phone. He would wake up, he would look at the screen, and for the first time since this nightmare began, he would be the one afraid of the dark. I closed the laptop. I did not need the lights to be on anymore. I knew exactly where I was going. The silence that followed my email was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a held breath before a scream. I sat in the darkened library of the Ironwood, the glow of my laptop screen the only light in the room, watching the digital ripples of my stone throw. I had expected them to react, but I had underestimated the sheer velocity of their panic. My father did not reply to the email. Of course he did not. Robert Willoughby was too smart to create a paper trail, or so he thought. Instead, he turned his paranoia outward. Through the network of pinhole cameras that were still recording, though now the data was streaming directly to my encrypted drive, I watched the chaos unfold in their penthouse. They were tearing their own lives apart. They fired their housekeeper of 20 years, accusing her of spying. They threatened their driver. They were looking for the leak everywhere except the one place it actually was, the terrified, incompetent daughter they believed was cowering in the dark. They thought I was weak. They thought I was stupid, and that was the only armor I had left. 2 days after I sent the photo of the pill bottle, Cynthia went on the offensive. I watched it live on the morning news, a surreal experience of seeing my own life distorted through the lens of high-definition victimhood. She sat on a beige sofa in a studio, clutching a tissue she never actually used, her eyes glistening with practiced moisture. "We just want to help her," Cynthia told the interviewer, her voice trembling with a fragility that would have won her an award on Broadway. "Agnes is confused. She is grieving. But by freezing the assets, by refusing to communicate, she is not hurting us. She is hurting the legacy of her grandmother. We are at risk of losing everything. She wants to see her own parents destitute. Who does that to their own flesh and blood?" I turned off the television. The anger that used to burn hot in my chest had cooled into something solid and heavy, like a stone in my gut. They were trying to bait me. They wanted me to lash out, to scream, to look crazy. So I did the opposite. I picked up the phone and called my father. It rang once. "Hello?" His voice was sharp, wary. "Dad?" I whispered. I made sure my voice was thin, bordering on hysterical. I practiced the tremor in the mirror before I dialed. "Dad, I saw Mom on TV. Please, I cannot take this anymore." There was a pause. I could hear him breathing. The sudden shift in his demeanor from defensive to predatory. He smelled blood. "Agnes," he said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming smooth and paternal. "We did not want to do that. Sweetheart, you left us no choice. You have shut us out. I am scared," I said, letting a sob hitch in my throat. "The lights are out. The water is gone. I am cold. I do not want to fight anymore. I just want it to stop. We can make it stop, Robert said quickly. We can fix everything. But we need to meet. Face to face. No lawyers. Just family. I hesitated, counting to 3 in my head to sell the reluctance. Okay, I said. But not at the house. I am afraid of the house now. We will meet at Le Monde, he said. Tonight, 7 o'clock. It is neutral ground. We will buy you a hot meal. Le Monde. It was fitting. It was the most expensive restaurant in the city, a place of velvet ropes and gold leaf. Where the silence was bought with exorbitant menu prices, it was a stage. They wanted witnesses to my surrender. I hung up the phone and went to my closet. This was a performance, and I needed the right costume. I bypassed the sharp blazers and tailored trousers I usually wore to the museum. Instead, I chose a baggy gray sweater that swallowed my frame and a pair of jeans that had seen better days. I washed my face but applied no makeup, leaving the dark circles under my eyes visible. I pulled my hair back into a messy, loose ponytail. I looked exhausted. I looked defeated. I looked exactly like the broken child they expected to see. But under the sweater, taped securely to the inside of my bra strap, was a tiny, high-fidelity microphone. And replacing the second button of my cardigan was a camera lens no larger than a pinhead, wired to a battery pack in my pocket. It was spycraft I had learned from the very best. My grandmother's archive. I arrived at Le Monde at exactly 7 o'clock. The maitre d' looked at my attire with a sneer that vanished the moment I mentioned the name Willoughby. He led me to a private booth in the back, secluded enough for conversation, but visible enough that half the room could see us. Robert and Cynthia were already there. They looked immaculate. Cynthia was wearing pearls that cost more than my car. Robert was in a suit that looked like it had been ironed by God himself. When they saw me, a look of triumphant pity washed over their faces. Agnes, Cynthia cooed, not standing up to hug me but gesturing to the seat opposite them. You look terrible. Darling. I sat down, keeping my eyes on the tablecloth. My shoulders hunched. I am tired. Mom, I mumbled. I haven't slept in weeks. Robert poured a glass of water and pushed it toward me. He did not ask if I was hungry. He did not ask about the house. He placed a folder on the table. It was thick, bound in blue leather. Let us cut to the chase. Agnes, Robert said. His voice was low, devoid of the warmth he had feigned on the phone. We know you are overwhelmed. This estate is too much for a girl like you. The legal battles, the taxes, the maintenance, it will crush you. I looked at the folder, then up at him, widening my eyes. I just want the lawsuits to stop. I said, I do not want to go to jail. You won't go to jail, Cynthia said, sipping her wine. Not if you sign this. She tapped a manicured fingernail on the leather cover. What is it? I asked. It is a transfer of deed, Robert explained. You sign over the Ironwood estate, the art collection, and the portfolio to us. In exchange, we drop the lawsuit, we drop the fraud charges. We will issue a statement saying it was all a misunderstanding caused by grief. I stared at them. They wanted everything. They wanted to strip me clean. And, I asked, my voice trembling, what happens to me? Cynthia smiled, a tight, cold expression that did not reach her eyes. We are generous parents. Agnes, we have included a stipend. She opened the folder and pointed to a figure at the bottom of the second page. $50,000, she said, a lump sum. It is enough for you to get an apartment, maybe go back to school, start over somewhere else, somewhere far away. $50,000. The estate was worth nearly $7 million. They were offering me less than 1%. It was an insult so profound it almost made me break character. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing in their faces. 50,000? I whispered. But Grandma left me everything. Grandma was sick, Robert snapped, his patience fraying instantly. He leaned across the table. Invading my space. Listen to me, Agnes. You have two choices. You sign this paper, Take the $50,000 and walk away with your freedom, or we continue this lawsuit. We will bleed you dry. We will bury you in legal fees until you are living in a cardboard box. And then, when you have nothing left, we will have you thrown in prison for elder abuse." I started to cry. It was easy. I just thought about the Tuesday pills. I thought about the heart medication. I thought about the way they had looked at her coffin. But I did not do anything wrong. I sobbed, keeping my hands on the table, making sure the button camera had a clear line of sight to his face. I loved her. "Love does not pay the bills," Cynthia said, disgusted by my tears. "Grow up, Agnes. The world is eaten by the strong. You are just food." I took a deep breath, wiping my nose on my sleeve, a gesture I knew Cynthia would detest. I received an email. I stammered. "A few days ago." The air at the table froze. Robert went perfectly still. Cynthia's glass stopped halfway to her mouth. "What email?" Robert asked, his voice deadly quiet. "It was a picture," I said, looking up at them, letting fear radiate from my eyes, of a hand and a pillbox. I watched the color drain from Cynthia's face. It was instantaneous. She looked like she had been slapped. Robert's jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth would crack. "Who sent it?" Robert hissed. "I don't know." I cried. "It was anonymous. It said something about heart pills." "Dad, what does it mean? Is someone watching us?" Robert slammed his hand down on the table, making the silverware jump. The couple at the next table looked over, startled. "It means nothing," he snarled. "It is a fake. Someone is trying to blackmail us. Probably one of your little friends." He was rattled. He was terrified. And when Robert Willoughby was terrified, he became reckless. "I do not think it is fake," I whispered. "It looked like Mom's hand." "Shut up," Cynthia hissed. "You stupid girl." "Do not say another word, Agnes," Robert said, his voice dropping to a terrifying growl. He leaned in so close I could smell the scotch on his breath. "You are going to sign this paper, right now. You are going to sign it, and then you are going to forget you ever saw that email. Do you understand me?" I shook my head. Shrinking back into the booth, "I am scared. Dad, maybe I should show it to the police. Maybe they can find out who sent it." "No," Robert shouted. He grabbed my wrist. His grip was painful. "Listen to me. You do not talk to the police. You do not talk to anyone. You have no idea what you are dealing with." He squeezed harder. I winced. "You think you are safe because she is dead?" Robert said, his eyes wild. "You think you are protected? Let me tell you something about your grandmother. She was a stubborn old woman who refused to do what was best for the family. And look what happened to her." I held my breath. This was it. The bait was in the water. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Robert sneered. His arrogance, fueled by fear and alcohol, took the wheel. "I mean that health is a fragile thing. Agnes," he said, "especially when you become a liability. Her heart gave out because she was weak. And you look very weak right now." He paused, letting the threat hang in the air between us like a guillotine blade. "You should remember how fast her health collapsed," he whispered. "One day she was fine. The next she was confused, tired, her heart failing. It happened so quickly. It would be a tragedy if the stress of this lawsuit caused you to have a similar decline. You do not want to end up like her, do you? Gasping for air in that big, empty house?" I felt a cold shiver go down my spine. It was not fear. It was satisfaction. He had said it. He had connected the decline of her health to a deliberate act, and he had threatened me with the same fate. It was a veiled confession, wrapped in a death threat. And the little camera on my chest had caught every pixel of his malice. The microphone had captured every syllable of his threat. I looked down at his hand on my wrist. I needed to end this scene before I vomited. "Okay," I whispered. "Okay, you win. I will sign." Robert released my wrist instantly. He sat back, straightening his tie, the mask of the civilized businessman sliding back into place. "Smart girl," he said. He pushed the pen toward me. "Sign it." I picked up the pen. My hand was shaking. but not from nerves. I hovered the pen over the signature line. Then I stopped. I cannot sign it here, I said. Cynthia's eyes narrowed. Why not? It is not legal, I said. Mr. Sterling told me he told me that for a transfer this big. It has to be done in front of a judge, or a notary of the court. If I sign it here, on a napkin in a restaurant, the bank might reject it, and then you won't get the money before the audit. I saw Robert flinch at the word audit. He knew I was right about the timeline. He needed this to be ironclad. Fine, Robert said. The hearing is on Friday. The settlement conference. Yes, I said. Friday. I will bring the papers. I will tell the judge I want to settle. I will sign everything over to you in front of everyone. That way, nobody can say you forced me. It will be clean. Robert looked at Cynthia. They exchanged a look of pure avarice. They saw the logic in it. A public capitulation in court would vindicate them completely. It would restore their reputation. It would make them look like the benevolent victors. Friday. Robert agreed. 9 o'clock. Do not be late. And Agnes? Yes? If you try anything, if you show that picture to anyone, remember what I said about your health? I understand. I said softly. I stood up. I did not say goodbye. I walked out of the restaurant, feeling their eyes on my back. They were smiling. I knew they were smiling. They were clinking their glasses, toasting to their victory, to the $50,000 they would throw at me, to the millions they had just secured. I walked out into the cool night air of the city. I walked 2 blocks until I was sure I wasn't being followed. Then, I ducked into a pharmacy. I went to the bathroom and locked the door. I reached into my shirt and unclipped the microphone. I pulled the camera from my buttonhole. I connected the device to my phone and played back the file. The video was perfect. The audio was crisp. You do not want to end up like her. Do you? It would be a tragedy if you had a similar decline. I leaned against the sink and looked at myself in the mirror. The gray sweater, the messy hair, the dark circles. I looked like a victim. But the eyes looking back at me were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a judge who had just heard the final testimony. They had signed their names to the devil's ledger tonight. On Friday, I was going to cash the check. I pulled out my phone and dialed Sterling. Mr. Sterling. I said, Agnes, how did it go? Get the presentation ready, I said, my voice steady and cold. We are going to court. Did they offer a settlement? They offered me $50,000 and a threat. I said, and what are you going to offer them? Sterling asked. I smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile that felt foreign on my face. I'm going to offer them a front row seat to their own funeral. 3 days before the hearing that would determine the fate of my grandmother's legacy. I sat in the command center I had created in the library of the Ironwood. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight against the morning sun. The air smelled of stale coffee and the ozone scent of overheating electronics. My laptop was running hot, processing the endless stream of data from Project Nemesis. I thought I had reached the bottom of the barrel. I thought discovering my parents' murderous greed was the absolute limit of what my heart could handle. I was wrong. The barrel had a false bottom, and underneath it lay a betrayal that hurt far more than the cruelty of my father or the venom of my mother. I was sifting through a subfolder labeled Associates, looking for evidence of the doctors my parents had bribed. Instead, I found a video file tagged with a name that made my breath hitch in my throat. Julian, Uncle Julian, my father's younger brother, growing up. Julian had been the only splash of color in the gray world of the Willoughby family. While Robert and Cynthia were busy climbing social ladders in Europe, Julian was the one who remembered my birthdays. He was the one who sent me postcards from his travels. He was the soft-spoken, slightly eccentric uncle who always seemed a bit out of place at the rigid family dinners, rolling his eyes at Robert's pomposity and sneaking me extra dessert when my mother wasn't looking. He was the one person, besides my grandmother, who I thought loved me. I clicked the video file with a trembling hand, praying it was a mistake, praying he was just a bystander. The timestamp was from 3 weeks ago. The location was my father's study in the city penthouse. The video opened. Robert was sitting behind his massive oak desk, counting out stacks of $100 bills. Julian was standing opposite him, looking nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Here's the 5,000, Robert said, sliding the envelope across the polished wood. Julian picked it up. He did not look like the fun uncle I knew. He looked hungry. He looked weak. "Did you get the account numbers?" Robert asked. Not even looking up. Julian nodded, tucking the envelope into his jacket pocket. "I got them. She uses First National for her savings, and she has a small investment account at Vanguard. I also got the routing number for her direct deposit from the museum." My stomach turned over. That was how they had done it. That was how the freeze order had hit me so fast, locking me out of my own salary before I even knew I was being sued. Julian had given them the keys. "There is more," Julian said, his voice dropping. "She is talking to Sterling. I saw his car at the estate yesterday." "Good," Robert sneered. "Keep watching her. I want to know who she talks to, where she goes, and what she eats. If she sneezes, I want to know about it." I closed the laptop, feeling physically ill. The betrayal was absolute. Julian wasn't just a bystander. He was a spy. He was the reason I had felt so exposed, so cornered. The kindness he had shown me over the years, was that fake too? Or was he just so desperate for money that he was willing to sell out his only niece for $5,000? I paced the library floor, the anger boiling in my veins, replacing the hurt. I could have added this video to the pile for the judge. It would discredit him. But then I stopped. I looked at the statue of the thinker in the hall. "Agnes is too gentle." My grandmother had written, "She needs a weapon." Destroying Julian was easy. But using him? That was what Eleanor would have done. I went back to the computer. I dug deeper into the Julian folder. I found another video, dated just 2 days ago. This one was different. Julian wasn't in the room. It was just Robert and Cynthia, drinking scotch after our dinner at Le Monde. I watched the clip. I listened to what they said, and slowly, a cold, predatory smile spread across my face. I picked up the phone and dialed Julian's number. "Agnes?" He answered on the second ring, his voice dripping with faux concern. "I heard about the settlement meeting. Are you okay, sweetheart? I need to see you. Uncle Julian," I said, making my voice sound small and broken. "I am going to sign the papers on Friday, but I am scared. I need someone I can trust to look over the agreement. Not a lawyer, just family." "Of course," Julian said, the relief in his voice palpable. "I will come right over. I am always here for you. Agnes." He arrived an hour later. He drove a modest sedan, a stark contrast to Robert's limousine. He walked into the library with his arms open, ready to hug the victim. "Agnes," he sighed, pulling me into a hug that made my skin crawl. "I know this is hard, but it is for the best. Your father just wants to protect the legacy." I pulled away gently and gestured for him to sit in the high-backed leather chair opposite the desk. I sat in my grandmother's chair. It felt big, but for the first time, I felt like I filled it. "Thank you for coming." "Julian," I said, "I have been going through some old things, memories. I am glad you are being sensible," Julian said, settling in. "This fight is destroying the family. Robert is very upset. You know, he loves you." I stared at him. The lie hung in the air, thick and suffocating. "Does he?" I asked softly. "Does he love you, Julian?" Julian blinked, surprised by the shift in tone. "Of course. We are brothers. We have our differences. But blood is thicker than water." I nodded slowly. I reached out and turned the laptop around so the screen faced him. "I found something." "Julian," I said, "I think you should see it." Julian frowned, leaning forward. "Is this the email Robert was talking about? The picture of the pills?" "Agnes, you should not be—" "It is not the pills." I cut him off. "Watch." I pressed play. It was the video from 2 nights ago. Robert and Cynthia in the penthouse. Julian is getting greedy. Robert said on the screen, swirling his scotch. He asked for another 10,000 yesterday. Give it to him, Cynthia replied, her voice bored. He is useful. He is a parasite. Robert spat. A useless, gambling drunk. But he serves a purpose. On the screen. Robert leaned back, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. When the audit hits in March, Robert said, we are going to need a scapegoat for the missing $6 million. I am not going to prison for this. Cynthia? And Julian will? Cynthia asked. I have already set it up. Robert laughed. I have been routing the embezzled funds through a shell company under Julian's name for 6 months. I forged his signature on the transfer documents. When the SEC comes looking, they won't find Robert Willoughby. They will find Julian Willoughby, the failed brother who stole from the family firm to pay off his gambling debts. He will go to jail for 20 years, Cynthia noted, sounding like she was discussing the weather. Better him than me, Robert said, raising his glass in a toast. To family. The video ended. The silence in the library was deafening. I watched Julian. His face had gone from confused to pale, and then to a sickly shade of gray. He stared at the black screen, his mouth slightly open, his hands gripping the arms of the chair so hard his knuckles were white. He is lying, Julian whispered. His voice was barely a squeak. I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the desk. Is he? I asked. Think about it. Julian, why did he ask you to handle those specific accounts last year? Why did he ask for your signature on those blank incorporation papers? He told you it was for tax purposes, didn't he? Julian looked at me, his eyes wide with horror. He was replaying every interaction he had had with his brother over the last year. The pieces were falling into place, and the picture they formed was a prison cell. He set me up. Julian choked out. Tears began to well in his eyes. Real tears this time. He is going to send me to prison. I helped him. I spied on you for him. I gave him your bank codes. And he is going to frame me? He calls you a parasite. Julian. I said, my voice cold and steady. He thinks you are a disposable idiot. He is going to walk away with the $6.8 million, and you are going to spend the rest of your life in a federal penitentiary. Julian put his head in his hands and began to sob. It was a pathetic, ugly sound. The sound of a man realizing that his entire life's loyalty had been a suicide pact. I let him cry for a full minute. I needed him broken. I needed him desperate. Then, I threw him the rope. You can stop him, I said. Julian looked up, his face streaked with tears. How? He has the lawyers. He has the money. I am nobody. You are a witness, I said, and you have access. I stood up and walked around the desk, standing over him. I know Robert keeps a second set of books. Julian, I know he has a ledger where he records the real transactions, the bribes, the embezzlement. He is too arrogant to destroy it because he thinks it is his trophy. Do you know where it is? Julian hesitated. He wiped his nose with his sleeve. I think so, he stammered. He keeps a black ledger in the floor safe at the office. The one behind the bookshelf. I know the combination. He sent me to get cash from it once. Get it, I commanded. Julian looked at me, fear warring with anger in his eyes. If I steal it, he will kill me. If you do not steal it, he will bury you. I countered. This is your only chance. Julian, you bring me that ledger, and we walk into court on Friday together. You testify that you were coerced. You testify that he planned to frame you. You give the judge the physical proof of his fraud. And what happens to me? Julian asked. I took money from him to spy on you. I am an accomplice. I looked down at him. I could have promised him immunity, but I was done lying. You will probably get probation. I said honestly, maybe a short sentence if the judge is harsh. But Robert will go away for life, and you will have the satisfaction of knowing you were the one who locked the cell door. Julian stared at the floor. I could see the gears turning. The fear of Robert was strong. But the hatred, the fresh, burning hatred of a betrayed brother, was stronger. He stood up. His legs were shaky, but his jaw was set. I will get it, he said. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. He looked back at me, and for a second, I saw a flash of the uncle I used to love. "I am sorry. Agnes," he whispered, "for everything. Just bring the book. Julian." I said. He left. I watched through the window as his car sped down the driveway, kicking up gravel. I immediately picked up the phone and called Sterling. "Agnes?" Sterling answered. "It is late. Get the presentation ready." I said, "I have a new witness." "Who?" "Julian." I said. There was a pause on the line. Then, Sterling let out a low whistle. "You turned Julian? How?" "I showed him his future." I said. "And he is bringing us the black ledger." I said. "The physical proof of the embezzlement. My God." Sterling said. "If we have that ledger, coupled with the videos, Agnes, this isn't a defense anymore. This is a demolition. Prepare the multimedia setup for the courtroom." I instructed. "I want 2 screens, big ones, and sound, high-quality sound." "Agnes," Sterling said, his voice serious, "are you sure you want to do this? Once we play those tapes, there is no going back. You will be destroying your family publicly. The press will feast on this for years." I looked around the dark library. I looked at the empty chair where my grandmother used to sit. I remembered the pills in the organizer. I remembered the fear in my father's voice when he threatened my life at the restaurant. "I do not have a family." "Mr. Sterling," I said, "I have a target." I hung up the phone. The next 24 hours were a blur of nervous tension. I barely slept. I sat by the window, watching the driveway, terrified that Robert had caught Julian, that my uncle was lying dead in a ditch somewhere. But on Thursday night, just 12 hours before the hearing, headlights swept across the lawn. Julian stumbled through the front door. He was pale, sweating, and his suit was disheveled. He looked like he was having a heart attack, but in his hands, clutched tight to his chest like a holy relic, was a thick, leather-bound book. He handed it to me. His hands were shaking so hard he almost dropped it. I opened it. It was all there. Handwritten entries in Robert's distinct script. Dates, amounts, names of bribed officials, the transfers to the shell company under Julian's name. It was a roadmap of 10 years of white-collar crime. "We have him," I whispered. Julian collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. "It is over," he sobbed. "No. Julian," I said, closing the heavy book with a thud that echoed through the hall. I looked at the statue of the thinker, standing stoic in the shadows. "It is just beginning." The courtroom was a theater of mahogany and silence, designed to intimidate anyone who did not have a 6-figure salary. We were in the private hearing room of Judge Harrison, a space usually reserved for high-stakes divorce settlements and corporate mergers, not family feuds. The air conditioning was set to a temperature that felt like the inside of a refrigerator, likely a tactic to keep tempers cool, though it did nothing to freeze the bead of sweat I saw trickling down my father's temple. It was Friday morning, the day of the settlement conference. On the left side of the long, polished table sat the opposition. It looked less like a legal team and more like a Roman legion. Robert and Cynthia were flanked by 4 attorneys from Viper and Cross, 2 paralegals who were frantically organizing binders of documents, and a man in a tweed suit who I recognized from the surveillance videos as Dr. Thorne, the corrupt psychiatrist. They took up 3/4 of the table, spreading their files and laptops like they were colonizing the room. On the right side sat Arthur Sterling and me, just the 2 of us. We had 1 laptop, a projector cable, and a pitcher of water. To the casual observer, it looked like a massacre waiting to happen. Robert caught my eye as I sat down. He smoothed the lapel of his $3,000 suit and gave me a tight, knowing nod. It was the look of a man who believed the game was rigged in his favor because he had paid for the dealer. He tapped the blue folder in front of him, the settlement agreement I had promised to sign. He thought I was here to surrender. He thought the $50,000 was already transferring to my account, buying my silence and my dignity. Judge Harrison entered the room, his black robe swooping around him. He was an older man with a face carved from granite and eyes that had seen too many lies to be patient. He sat at the head of the table and peered over his reading glasses. "This is a preliminary hearing regarding the contested will of Eleanor Rose Willoughby," the judge said, his voice booming without a microphone. "We are here to determine if there is sufficient cause to proceed to a full trial or if a settlement can be reached. Mr. Cross, you represent the plaintiffs. You may begin." Mr. Cross, the lead attorney for my parents, stood up. He was a man who looked like he was made of sharp angles, sharp nose, sharp chin, sharp suit. He did not look at me. He looked at the judge with a practiced gravity. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth as oil, "this case is a tragedy. It is not about money. It is about the exploitation of a vulnerable elderly woman by the very person entrusted with her care." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, under the table. My knee was bouncing. But above it, I was a statue. Cross continued, pacing slightly. "We will present evidence that the defendant, Agnes Willoughby, engaged in a systematic campaign of isolation and psychological manipulation, a technique known as gaslighting, to alienate Mrs. Eleanor Willoughby from her loving son and daughter-in-law. We have sworn affidavits from former staff members who witnessed the defendant shouting at the deceased, denying her food, and screening her calls to prevent family contact." He gestured to the paralegal, who handed a thick stack of papers to the judge. "These are the statements of Mrs. Higgins, the former housekeeper, and Mr. Gupta, the former gardener," Cross said. "Both were fired by the defendant shortly after she took control of the household finances. They describe a house of fear, Your Honor, a house where a confused, sick old woman was terrified of her own granddaughter. I remembered Mrs. Higgins. She had been fired 5 years ago for stealing silver cutlery. My father had rehired her last week, presumably with a significant signing bonus, to write this fiction." Cross then pointed to Dr. Thorne. "We also have the expert medical opinion of Dr. Thorne, a renowned geriatric psychiatrist. Although he was prevented from treating Mrs. Willoughby personally by the defendant, he has reviewed her medical files and the anecdotal evidence. His conclusion is clear. Mrs. Willoughby was suffering from advanced vascular dementia, rendering her incapable of understanding the implications of the new will. She was a puppet, Your Honor, and Agnes Willoughby held the strings." The judge frowned, flipping through the pages of the medical report. He looked at me, and for the first time, I saw doubt in his eyes. The story Cross was weaving was compelling. It fit the narrative of the greedy, youthful caretaker preying on the helpless elder. It was a lie, but it was a logical lie. Then came the centerpiece of their performance. "My client, Cynthia Willoughby, wishes to speak," Cross said, stepping aside. Cynthia stood up. She was dressed in a modest navy blue dress, wearing no jewelry except a simple gold cross, a prop she had bought yesterday. Considering she had not stepped foot in a church since her wedding, she looked exhausted, her makeup applied to accentuate the pale fragility of a grieving mother. "Your Honor," Cynthia said, her voice trembling just enough to be audible. She paused to dab her eyes with a tissue. "We do not want this money for ourselves. We are comfortable. This lawsuit is agonizing for us. We are suing because it is what Eleanor would have wanted." She looked at the judge with wide, wet eyes. "My mother-in-law had a dream." Cynthia lied, her voice gaining a passionate strength. She wanted to establish the Eleanor Willoughby Foundation for the Arts. She wanted her fortune to go to charity, to help underprivileged children experience the beauty of the Renaissance. Agnes knew this. But when Eleanor got sick, Agnes changed everything. She twisted Eleanor's mind. She convinced her that we were the enemies. Cynthia turned to look at me, and the venom in her eyes was masked by a look of profound disappointment. "I forgive you, Agnes," she said, and the audacity of it almost made me laugh out loud. "I know you are young. I know $7 million is a lot of temptation. But please, do the right thing. Do not let your grandmother's legacy be stained by this greed. Let us use the money to help the children, as she intended." She sat down, burying her face in Robert's shoulder. Robert patted her back. Looking at the judge with a stoic, suffering expression, it was a masterclass. If I did not know that she was poisoning Eleanor's tea 3 weeks ago, I might have believed her myself. Judge Harrison took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. He looked at Sterling. "Mr. Sterling," the judge said, his tone weary. "The plaintiffs have presented a very strong prima facie case for undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. The medical report is damning. The witness statements are consistent. If this goes to trial, your client faces a significant risk, not just of losing the estate, but of facing criminal charges for elder abuse and fraud." The room went silent. The threat hung in the air like smoke. "Mr." Cross stood up again. "Sensing the kill, we are willing to be generous." "Your Honor," Cross said, "we have prepared a settlement agreement. If Ms. Willoughby relinquishes her claim to the estate today, we will drop the lawsuit. We will not pursue criminal charges. We will even provide a small stipend to help her transition. But this offer expires the moment we leave this room." He slid the blue folder across the table toward me. It stopped right in front of my hands. "Sign it," Robert mouthed, his eyes boring into mine. I looked at the folder, then I looked at the judge. Then I looked at the wall of lawyers. They were all watching me, expecting the scared girl from the restaurant to pick up the pen and fold. They expected tears. They expected begging. I did none of those things. I sat back in my chair and crossed my legs. I did not touch the folder. I just stared at Robert. I kept my face completely blank. No fear, no anger, no sadness. Just a flat, unreadable void. Robert's smirk faltered. He shifted in his seat. He looked at Cynthia, then back at me. He was expecting the capitulation. My silence was not part of the script. "Ms. Willoughby?" the judge prompted. "Do you understand the gravity of the situation?" I turned to the judge. I did not stand up. "I understand perfectly, Your Honor," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and clear. It did not sound like the voice of a defendant. It sounded like the voice of a prosecutor. "Then you accept the settlement?" the judge asked. "No," I said. A ripple of shock went through the opposition side. Cross looked confused. Robert's face darkened, the vein in his temple beginning to throb. "Ms. Willoughby," Judge Harrison said, his patience thinning, "you are facing a team of senior litigators and serious allegations. You have offered no defense. You have no witnesses listed. You have submitted no counter-arguments. On what grounds are you rejecting this offer?" I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I looked directly at Robert, ignoring the lawyers entirely. "They claim my grandmother was senile," I said. "They claim she did not know what she was doing. They claim I silenced her." I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. "I think it is only fair that we let Eleanor speak for herself," I said. Robert let out a loud, incredulous laugh. It was a harsh, barking sound that echoed in the sterile room. "She is dead. Agnes," Robert scoffed, shaking his head as if I were a petulant child. "What are you going to do? Conduct a séance? Are you going to pull out a Ouija board?" "Your Honor, this is a waste of the court's time. She is clearly unstable." Cynthia giggled nervously. "She is having a breakdown. Poor thing." I did not break eye contact with Robert. I did not blink. No séance. "Father," I said softly, "just the truth." I nodded to Mr. Sterling, who had been sitting quietly with his hands folded, sprang into action. He did not look like a tired old probate lawyer anymore. He moved with the precision of a technician. He opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick, braided HDMI cable. He plugged one end into the laptop and the other into the port on the conference table that controlled the room's audiovisual system. "What is this?" Cross demanded. Standing up, "We have not received any discovery regarding digital evidence. I object to—" "Sit down, Mr. Cross," Judge Harrison barked. His curiosity piqued. "This is a settlement hearing, not a jury trial. I have broad discretion to review evidence. Proceed, Ms. Willoughby." The lights in the room dimmed automatically as the large projection screen behind the judge descended from the ceiling. It hummed as it lowered, a white canvas that was about to become a firing squad. Robert looked at the screen, then at me. The mockery was draining from his face, replaced by a slow-dawning horror. He looked at the laptop. He looked at the cable. He realized, in that second, that I had not brought a defense. I had brought a weapon. "Your Honor," I said, standing up now. "My parents told you a story about a sick old woman who lost her mind. They told you a story about a devoted son and daughter who just wanted to help." I typed a password into the laptop. The screen flared to life, projecting the logo of Project Nemesis in stark green letters against a black background. "I would like to show you a different story." I continued. "I call my first and only witness, Eleanor Rose Willoughby." I clicked the first file. The screen filled with the high-definition image of the drawing room at the Ironwood. The date stamp in the corner was clear, October 14th, 2025. Robert froze. His hand, which had been resting on the table, curled into a claw. Cynthia stopped breathing. The audio kicked in. It was crisp, amplified by the courtroom speakers. "We cannot wait for nature to take its course. Robert," Cynthia's voice boomed through the room, magnified 10 times over, "the company needs the capital injection by the end of the fiscal year." The lawyers from Viper and Cross stopped shuffling their papers. They looked up at the screen, their mouths falling open. "She is stubborn." "Cynthia," Robert's voice answered from the screen. "And she is healthy. Her heart is strong. Then we make her unhealthy," the recorded Cynthia said. On the screen, the two of them clinked wine glasses. In the courtroom, real-life Cynthia let out a strangled gasp. She looked at the screen, then at the judge, then at me. Her face went white, the color of old paper. "Mr." Cross looked at his clients. He looked at the video. He looked at the date stamp. He was a smart man. He realized in 2 seconds that he had just walked into a trap that would end his career if he did not distance himself immediately. I did not stop. I clicked the next file. The kitchen scene. The pill swap. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Cynthia's hand, magnified to the size of a billboard, swapped the heart medication for the placebo. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his glasses sliding down his nose. He was not looking at the legal papers anymore. He was watching a felony being committed in 4K resolution. "That is a deep fake," Robert shouted, jumping to his feet. He knocked his chair over. It crashed loudly against the wall. "That is AI. It is fake. She made it on a computer. Sit down. Mr. Willoughby," the judge roared, slamming his hand on the bench. I turned to Robert. I spoke calmly, my voice cutting through his panic like a razor. "It is not a fake, Robert," I said, "and neither is this." I clicked the next file, the video of Robert in his study, talking on the phone. "I need to plug the hole before the auditors arrive in March." The recorded Robert hissed, "If they see the gap, they will file criminal charges. This isn't just a fine, this is securities fraud." The air was sucked out of the room. The lawyers from Viper and Cross were physically inching away from Robert and Cynthia, creating a gap at the table as if my parents were contagious. Robert stood trembling, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped rat. He looked at the door, he looked at the judge, he looked at me. "You little bitch," he whispered. But in the silence of the room, it sounded like a scream. I looked at the judge. "Your Honor," I said, "I have 5 years of recordings. I have the medical logs matching the pill swaps to my grandmother's hospitalizations. And I have one more thing." I turned toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom. I motioned to the bailiff, "Please let him in." The doors opened, and the final nail in their coffin walked in. The double doors at the back of the hearing room swung shut behind Julian Willoughby, but the sound was swallowed by the thick silence that had descended upon us. My uncle stood there, looking like a ghost in a rumpled suit, clutching the black ledger to his chest with white-knuckled desperation. Robert twisted in his chair to look at his brother, his face a mask of confusion that was rapidly cracking into terror. He opened his mouth, perhaps to shout a command or a threat, but the words died in his throat. The stage did not belong to Julian yet. Not quite. I turned back to the projection screen, where the green logo of Project Nemesis was fading, replaced by a file thumbnail simply labeled Video 147. Your Honor, I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. My parents have spent the last hour telling you what my grandmother thought, what she felt, and what she intended. They have painted a portrait of a woman lost in the fog of dementia, but Eleanor Willoughby was never lost. She was simply waiting. I looked at Robert. He was gripping the edge of the table, his eyes locked on the screen. This video was recorded 3 days before she died. I said, and she recorded it for you. Dad, I pressed the enter key. The screen flared to life. The image was startlingly clear. The high-definition camera capturing every line on my grandmother's face, every strand of her silver hair. She was sitting in her favorite wingback chair in the library, the same chair I had sat in when I interrogated Julian. She was not wearing a hospital gown or pajamas. She was dressed in her Sunday best, a sharp tweed blazer and a silk scarf. She sat upright, her posture regal and defiant, with absolutely no sign of the frailty my parents had described. In her hands, she held a copy of the Chicago Tribune. She held it up to the camera, steady and deliberate, ensuring the date was visible. January 26th, 2026, the recorded Eleanor said. Her voice was not the weak, quavering whisper of a dying woman. It was strong. It was the voice that had commanded boardrooms for 40 years. She lowered the paper and looked directly into the lens. It felt as though she was looking directly into Robert's soul. Hello, Robert. Hello. Cynthia, Eleanor said. In the courtroom. Cynthia let out a small, strangled whimper. She covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide with disbelief. If you are watching this, Eleanor continued, a dry, humorless smile touching her lips, then I am dead. And more importantly, it means you have sued Agnes. I knew you would. I knew you could not resist the money. Robert flinched as if he had been physically struck. On the screen. Eleanor leaned forward slightly. You have likely told the lawyers that I am senile, she said. You have probably told them that I am confused, that I do not know what day it is, or that Agnes has manipulated me. You have probably hired that dreadful doctor, Thorne, to write a report saying my vascular dementia has progressed. Judge Harrison turned his head sharply to look at Dr. Thorne, the psychiatrist, who had been sitting smugly a moment ago, was now staring at his shoes, his face turning a sickly shade of red. I am not senile. Robert, Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a steely whisper. I am simply observant. I know my tea tastes bitter on Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays. I know it tastes bitter because Cynthia puts crushed pills in it when she thinks I'm napping in my wheelchair. Cynthia let out a scream. It was a high, piercing sound that shattered the decorum of the room. Stop it, she shrieked, jumping to her feet. Turn it off. I know you swap my heart medication. Cynthia, Eleanor continued, talking over Cynthia's real-time screams. I watched you do it. I have watched you for 5 years. The video on the screen suddenly cut away from Eleanor's face. It switched to a montage, a brutal, rapid-fire sequence of clips from the hidden cameras. First, the kitchen scene. The giant screen showed Cynthia's hand, clear as day, swapping the pills. Then, a clip from the dining room. Robert was pacing, holding a glass of scotch. Why won't the old witch just die? The recorded Robert shouted. She is hanging on out of spite. I need that money by March. Then, a clip from the hallway. Cynthia whispering to Robert, we will blame it on Agnes. We will say she isolated her. We will throw the girl to the wolves and take the estate. The audio was deafening. The words echoed off the mahogany walls, bouncing back to indict the people sitting at the table. Robert was shaking his head violently. No, this is not real. The video cut back to Eleanor. She was looking at the camera again, her expression filled with a profound, heartbreaking pity. I know about the audit. Robert, she said softly, I know about the $6.8 million you stole from the pension fund. I know you need my money to keep yourself out of prison. You thought I was a helpless old woman you could step over. But you forgot one thing. My son. She paused. The courtroom held its breath. You forgot that I am the one who taught you how to do business, she said. And in business, you never make a move until you have the leverage to destroy your opponent. Agnes is not your victim. She is my executioner. The screen went black. For 3 seconds, there was absolute silence. Then, hell broke loose. That is a lie, Cynthia screamed, her voice shredding the air. She pointed a trembling finger at the screen, then at me. It is a deep fake. It is AI. She generated it. That is not real. My mother-in-law never said that. Robert jumped up. Knocking his chair backward, he looked wild, his hair disheveled, sweat pouring down his face. Your Honor, Robert shouted, his voice cracking. I demand this evidence be stricken. This is a fabrication. Technology these days can fake anything. This is a deep fake video created by a desperate girl to frame her grieving parents. Judge Harrison looked at Robert with eyes that were cold as ice. Mr. Willoughby, sit down. I will not sit down, Robert roared, slamming his fist on the table. This is a setup. You cannot trust a video file. Where is the proof? Where is the physical proof? I stood up. I did not need to shout. The silence that followed Robert's outburst was my amplification. The proof is standing at the door. Father, I said. I turned and nodded to Julian. Julian took a breath. He stepped away from the door and walked down the center aisle of the room. He walked past the rows of empty benches. He walked past the stunned bailiff. He walked right up to the plaintiff's table. Robert looked at his brother. His eyes went wide. He saw the book in Julian's hands. Julian? Robert whispered. What are you doing? Julian did not look at Robert. He looked at me. Then he looked at the judge. Your Honor, Julian said, his voice shaking but audible. My name is Julian Willoughby. I am the brother of the plaintiff. He lifted the heavy black ledger and placed it on the judge's bench with a dull, heavy thud. This is not a deepfake, Julian said. This is the black ledger for Willoughby Holdings. It details the embezzlement of $6,800,000 from the Municipal Teachers' Pension Fund. It details the transfers to a shell company Robert created in my name to frame me, and it details the bribes paid to Dr. Thorne to falsify the medical records of Eleanor Willoughby. Doctor. Thorne let out a squeak of terror and slumped in his chair, looking like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. Robert lunged. It happened so fast. 1 second Robert was standing there, paralyzed by the sight of the ledger, and the next, he was moving with the desperation of a cornered animal. He lunged across the gap between him and Julian, his hands reaching for the book, reaching for his brother's throat. You traitor, Robert screamed. You useless little parasite. I will kill you. Bailiff, Judge Harrison shouted. The bailiff was already moving. He intercepted Robert before he could reach Julian. Tackling him backward, Robert crashed into the table, sending pitchers of water and legal files flying everywhere. He scrambled, trying to get up, shouting obscenities that would make a sailor blush. It is all lies, Robert screamed as the bailiff pinned his arms behind his back. She made it all up. Cynthia stood frozen amidst the chaos, staring at the screen where her dead mother-in-law had just condemned her. Then she looked at the ledger. She looked at the judge, and then, in a moment of pure, selfish clarity, she started screaming at her husband. It was his idea, Cynthia shrieked, pointing at Robert, who was currently being handcuffed on the floor. He made me do it. He told me we had to swap the pills. I did not want to. He forced me. Robert, his face pressed against the carpet, twisted his head to look at her. You shut your mouth. Cynthia, you poured the poison. I saw you. Order, Judge Harrison bellowed, banging his gavel so hard I thought the handle would snap. Order in this court. The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence, broken only by the heavy breathing of Robert and the quiet sobbing of Julian. Mr. Cross, the lead attorney for Viper and Cross, stood up. He was pale. He was looking at the ledger on the bench as if it were radioactive. He knew the law. He knew that presenting false evidence and suborning perjury was a career-ending offense. He knew that his client had just admitted to a felony in open court. He began to pack his briefcase with frantic speed. "Your Honor," Cross said, his voice tight, in light of the new evidence presented, specifically the undeniable video documentation and the physical ledger and the spontaneous admissions by the plaintiffs. "My firm can no longer represent Mr. and Mrs. Willoughby." He looked at Robert on the floor with absolute disgust. "We are withdrawing as counsel, effective immediately." Cross stated, "We were not made aware of the criminal nature of this enterprise. We were lied to by our clients." He did not wait for permission. He signaled to his team. The 4 lawyers and 2 paralegals practically ran for the door, abandoning their binders, abandoning their clients, fleeing the blast radius before the fallout could hit their licenses. "Doctor," Thorne tried to stand up and follow them. "Sit down." "Doctor," Judge Harrison barked, "you are not going anywhere. The bailiff will have some questions for you regarding your sworn affidavit." I stood there, watching the wreckage. My father was in handcuffs. My mother was hyperventilating and blaming her husband. My uncle was weeping. The high-priced lawyers had fled. Arthur Sterling stood up slowly next to me. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the empty chairs on the other side of the table. "Well," Sterling said softly, "I believe that concludes the settlement negotiations." Judge Harrison looked down at Robert, then at the ledger, then at the screen. He turned his gaze to me. There was a newfound respect in his eyes. "Ms. Willoughby," the judge said, "please provide that hard drive to the court." I picked up the external drive. I walked over to the bench. I did not look at my father as I passed him. He was just a noise on the floor now. "Here is the truth, Your Honor," I said. I handed him the drive. And just like that, the empire of lies my parents had built didn't just crumble, it evaporated. "Agnes," Robert rasped from the floor. "Agnes, please, we are your family." I stopped. I turned slowly. I looked down at him, the man who had threatened to kill me in a restaurant 3 days ago, the man who had laughed about throwing me out on the street. I looked at the screen where my grandmother's face was frozen in a pixelated stillness. "My family is on that screen," I said. "You are just the defendants." I turned my back on them and walked back to my seat. I sat down, folded my hands, and waited for the justice system to do exactly what Eleanor Rose Willoughby had designed it to do. The gavel came down with a sound that felt less like a judicial ruling and more like the crack of a whip. It echoed through the mahogany chamber, silencing the frantic whispers of the few remaining legal aides and the heavy, ragged breathing of my father on the floor. Judge Harrison did not look at the paperwork in front of him. He looked directly at the bailiff standing by the door, based on the extraordinary nature of the evidence presented, specifically the video testimony of the deceased and the physical ledger provided by Mr. Julian Willoughby. "I am dismissing the plaintiff's case with prejudice," the judge announced. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. "However, this court cannot ignore the commission of multiple felonies in its presence." He pointed a finger at Robert, who was currently being hauled to his feet by the bailiff, his wrists already secured in stainless steel handcuffs. "Mr. Bailiff, take Mr. Robert Willoughby into custody immediately." The judge ordered, "I am referring this matter to the district attorney's office with a recommendation for charges including grand larceny, securities fraud, perjury, and elder abuse." Robert struggled against the grip of the officer. His face was a mask of purple rage, the veins in his neck bulging as he realized the walls were not just closing in, they had already crushed him. He looked at the judge, then he looked at the empty table where his lawyers had been, and finally, his wild, desperate eyes landed on me. "You did this!" Robert screamed, spit flying from his mouth. "You ungrateful little witch! I gave you life!" He lunged. It was a pathetic, doomed attempt. He tried to throw himself across the barrier separating the gallery from the counsel tables, aiming for my throat, but he never made it. 2 officers tackled him instantly, slamming him face first into the carpet. The sound of his expensive suit tearing was audible in the silence. "It is her fault!" Robert howled into the floor, his voice muffled. "It was Cynthia. She told me to do it. She swapped the pills. I just wanted the money. She is the one who poisoned her." I turned my head slowly to look at my mother. Cynthia was standing by the plaintiff's table, clutching her chest. Her face had gone past pale. It was the color of ash. She had spent her entire life curating an image of untouchable elegance, of a woman who floated above the messy realities of the world. Now, stripped of her lawyers, her reputation, and her husband's protection, she looked small and brittle. When the second bailiff approached her, pulling a set of handcuffs from his belt, the reality finally pierced her delusion. Her eyes rolled back in her head. Her knees buckled. She did not crumple gracefully like she did in her staged fainting spells at parties. She hit the floor with a heavy, uncoordinated thud. It was the first honest thing she had done in 20 years. "Call the paramedics," Judge Harrison said, his voice bored. "And then place her under arrest. I want a guard in her hospital room until she is arraigned." I watched as they dragged my father out of the side door, still kicking and screaming obscenities about his brother and his daughter. I watched as the paramedics rushed in to attend to my mother. I felt nothing. No, that is not true. I felt a profound, quiet stillness. It was the feeling of a storm finally breaking, leaving the air clean and sharp. Mr. Sterling began packing up our laptop. His hands were shaking slightly, but he offered me a small, proud smile. "It is over. Agnes," he whispered. I looked at the blank screen where my grandmother's face had been moments before. "No, Mr. Sterling," I said, standing up and smoothing out my skirt. "It is just corrected." I walked out of the courtroom, head held high. The hallway was already swarming. The lawyers from Viper and Cross must have leaked the outcome as they fled. Or perhaps the screaming had just attracted attention. A dozen reporters with cameras and microphones were waiting. They surged forward like a tide as soon as I pushed through the double doors. "Agnes, is it true your father embezzled $6 million? Agnes, did your mother really poison Eleanor Willoughby? Ms. Willoughby, how does it feel to send your own parents to prison?" The flashes of the cameras were blinding, exploding in my face like strobe lights. Microphones were shoved toward me, demanding a soundbite, demanding tears, demanding a villain or a victim. I stopped for a brief second. I looked at the lens of the nearest camera. I thought about the interview Cynthia had given, the lies she had spun about saving the family legacy. I could have told them everything. I could have told them about the Tuesday pills. I could have told them about the cold nights without power. I could have become the media darling of the month, but I remembered my grandmother's lesson. The truth is a weapon, not a toy. I said nothing. I did not smile. I did not frown. I simply put on my sunglasses and walked through the crowd. My silence was louder than any headline they could write. I got into my car, the same small sedan my parents had sneered at, and drove away. The following months were a blur of legal proceedings, but this time, I was not the defendant, I was the witness. The contents of the black ledger Julian had provided were irrefutable. The forensic accountants found the $6,800,000 hole in the pension fund within 48 hours. My father was denied bail. The judge cited him as a significant flight risk. Given his offshore accounts and his erratic behavior in court, my mother recovered from her faint only to find herself in a detention cell. The video evidence of the pill swapping was verified by 3 independent experts. She tried to cut a deal, offering to testify against Robert, but the district attorney was not interested. They had everything they needed. Julian received a sentence of 3 years probation and a hefty fine for his role in the surveillance. It was a mercy, and he knew it. He moved to a small town in Ohio, away from the Willoughby name, to start over. He sends me a Christmas card every year. I never open them, but I do not throw them away either. As for me, I had work to do. The probate court released the assets to me 2 weeks after the arrest. The check that was deposited into my account was for exactly $6,842,000.50. I did not buy a yacht. I did not move to Paris. I drove back to the Ironwood. The estate was silent, but it no longer felt haunted. I hired a crew of contractors. We stripped the house. We pulled the pinhole cameras out of the ceiling. We removed the microphones from the chandeliers. We tore out the hidden servers in the basement. We opened the heavy velvet drapes that had been closed for decades and let the sunlight flood into the dark. Dusty rooms. I renamed the estate. It was no longer the Ironwood. It was now the Eleanor Willoughby Center for Legal Aid and Elder Care. I used the inheritance to establish a foundation dedicated to two things: providing aggressive, high-quality legal defense for the elderly who were being exploited by their families, and creating a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to go. The guest rooms where my parents used to stay when they wanted to play the role of dutiful children were turned into comfortable, sunlit suites for residents who had been abused, neglected, or robbed by their own kin. The library, where my grandmother had recorded her final message, became the center's main office. I sat at her desk, not as a tycoon, but as an administrator, ensuring that no other grandmother would ever have to rely on a secret camera to get justice. My career at Vanguard Heritage was waiting for me. Mr. Henderson called me a week after the trial, his voice dripping with apology. He offered me my job back with a 20% raise. He told me the board was horrified by how they had treated me. I declined. I realized that restoring old paintings for rich people was no longer enough. I wanted to build something new. I took a portion of the inheritance and rented a small, airy space in the Arts District. I opened a gallery called Renaissance, but it was not for the old masters. It was a space for young, struggling artists, restorers, sculptors, painters, who needed a place to work and be seen. It was the gallery I had always dreamed of owning, a place where art was about creation, not transaction. 6 months after the trial, on a crisp autumn afternoon, I drove to the cemetery. The leaves were turning gold and crimson, crunching softly under my boots as I walked toward the family plot. It was quiet here. The wind coming off the lake was cool, but it wasn't biting like it had been on the day of the funeral. I stood in front of my grandmother's grave. The headstone was simple granite, engraved with her name and dates. I had ordered a new inscription to be added at the bottom: Eleanor Rose Willoughby. She saw everything. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small, heavy object I had carried with me every day for the last half-year. The key. The antique key that opened the chest of the thinker statue. The key that had unlocked the truth and destroyed the lies. I knelt down in the grass. I had brought a small, watertight metal box. I placed the key inside the box and sealed it shut. I dug a small hole in the soft earth right next to her headstone, beneath the roots of the old oak tree that shaded her resting place. I placed the box in the hole and covered it up, packing the dirt down firmly. I did not need the key anymore. The secrets were out. The statue in the foyer of the new center was just a statue now, a piece of art for the residents to enjoy. The weapon had been fired, and now it could be laid to rest. I stood up and brushed the dirt from my knees. I looked at the grave one last time. They taught me that blood was a curse. "Grandma," I said softly, the wind carrying my words away. They taught me that family was just people who shared a last name and a bank account. They tried to make me into a victim. I paused, feeling a sense of peace settle over me that was warmer than the sun. "But you taught me that the truth is the only antidote." I continued. "You taught me that silence is not weakness, and that patience is the deadliest weapon of all. I am not Agnes the abandoned child anymore. I am not Agnes the victim." I touched the cold stone of the marker. "I am Agnes, the keeper of the legacy, and I promise you, I will keep the lights on." I turned and walked back to my car. I did not look back. I did not need to. The past was buried under 6 feet of earth and a mountain of court documents. I got into the driver's seat and started the engine. The radio was playing a soft jazz tune. I rolled down the windows and let the cool air rush in. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the cemetery gates. The road ahead was long and winding. Stretching out toward the city skyline that glittered in the distance, the sky above was a brilliant, piercing blue, without a single cloud to mar the perfection. It was the kind of sky that promised everything and nothing all at once. I was alone. I had no parents. I had no uncle, but for the first time in 28 years, I was completely, terrifiedly, wonderfully free. I pressed the gas pedal and drove toward the horizon, leaving the shadows of the ironwood far behind me. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope you enjoyed the journey of Agnes and her fight for justice. If you are listening to this, please comment below and let me know where you are tuning in from. I would love to connect with you and hear your thoughts on Robert and Cynthia's punishment. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel Sunday Drama Stories, like the video, and hit that hype button so this story can reach even more people. Your support means the world to me. See you in the next story.